Hello everyone, this is Colonel, and today we're going to be talking about Sauce Cup. Sauce Cup is the webcam tournament that's currently ongoing, which is a best of three, 5 rounds through Swiss. We have players from various areas, some from Japan, some from the English cipher chord, and also some from the French cipher chord as well. Throughout this, we have a couple MCs that are duplicates, Roy, Zephiel, and Crom, and we have many other MCs that, even though there's only a representation of one, doesn't mean that they are by no means MCs that are slacking. A few things that are notably missing here is Korin Kingdom of Vala is absent, which is kind of strange considering that within the English cipher chord it is a pretty strong deck. Another thing that's also missing is Soniki. Soniki is also an MC that has a lot of power within itself. Being a very tall MC that can basically have pretty potent late games. On the other hand, we do see a few interesting picks throughout here, but for the most part, most things here are within what I would say roughly the tier 1, tier 2 range, with a few tier 3 that can be kind of sleeper picks when they go off. So let's go ahead and discuss the MCs. We have Roy, which has 3 different MCs between HR, LIS, and B22 that usually are played. While B22 is what I would consider the superior option out of these three, by no means is LIS nor HR necessarily bad options either. HR has the capability of protecting all purple allies, which can be useful in matchups like Sylph, for example, and you also have LIS, which has a major burst turn thanks with Sue and Rutger. We also have Zephiel. Zephiel considered one of the top MCs within the Japanese community, and an MC that has been growing in popularity through the English cipher chord as of late. While it's an MC that is plagued by quite a few things that could potentially be teched against it, it is still an MC that, even though for a flip to discard one effect may not seem like much at first, being able to destroy MC or anything on the field, if that's the card that's ripped out, is pretty potent. Furthermore, it can also rip out plays that could be made on the next turn, which is also something that needs to be considered in the process. Being able to buff weenies from 60s to 80s, such as Myrrh and Faye, is also really nice, which basically means that most MCs and um, their allies are basically very prone to Zephiel as far as getting hit. Being ran into the face is always going to be the problem that Zephiel has to do. Though the thing is that because of his effect, the MCs are probably more than likely going to dodge against it, which increases the chances of ripping playmakers for the next turn as well. Overall, this is an MC that is very scary, and it could definitely pop off against a lot of these MCs. Next, we have Crom. Crom mostly has 2 MCs that are pretty much playable, both in Mono and Exalt. Mono usually relies a lot more on the 1 cost early game in order to try to make an impact, following up with class changes later on that try to make more value plays in the process. Furthermore, there's also XL Crom, which usually sacrifices a little bit of the early game for a much stronger late game. Also, being able to do things such as refreshing bonds as well as ramping in the process thanks to Sigurd. These MCs could also do a lot of havoc within the bracket, while Mono is definitely a little bit weaker than Exalt in particular. By no means is Mono necessarily a bad deck whatsoever. It's just mostly a deck that is usually overshadowed by Exalt. So now let's go ahead and go over the MCs that have been only brought by one person. We have Micaiah. Micaiah is mainly a green MC that uses set 22 in order to plus 30 after growth, and then after growthing for free, you can draw a card if you are at 4 cards or less. The thing that's nice is this combos well with Jill Find 3 as an example, since her skill also on destruction can growth any ally on the field, which includes Micaiah, which means you can also proc that skill twice in the same turn. While the Micaiah decks don't necessarily have to run Jill and Kurth Naga as an example, there are a few other variations such as Red Micaiah and Purple Micaiah that have been played, and there's also Beast Micaiah, which relies on Izuka in order to summon out big beatsticks. Next, we have Henry. Henry is usually fueled by one of 2 engines. Usually it's Jenny or Elise. The thing that makes this MC scary is that it's a discard 2 effect that starts from turn 2 on, making a lot of 5-4 MCs very vulnerable to its plays. This is because of Meyer, a skill that is once not necessarily once per turn, but the thing is that when you combine with class changes in the Henry deck, being either May or Jen, or not May, uh, Henry's friends Jenny or Elise. Thing is that in some turns you could discard up to 3 cards. Discarding 5 cards right away is also really bad, considering that you have to bond at least once per turn in order to keep going ahead. Combining this with stuff like Triandra and Medius, it can basically lock the opponent out from making a lot of plays, while Jenny usually can heal orbs through Overclass, and you have Elise, which usually helps with teetering at 1 to 0, while also being able to use her turn in order to heal back copies of things such as Elise, or not Elise, such as Henry, Medius, or anything else to extend plays. While the deck can be rather inconsistent, the thing is that when the deck does do its high roll, it's very devastating to a lot of MCs in the process. Next, we'll go ahead and talk about Oboro. Oboro is usually a very good white deck that often hasn't seen as much play these days, but it's still not a deck that should ever be shrugged off. Having attack emblem archers is pretty good because it allows a lot of the 60 base archers to hit for 100. This is important because a lot of MCs that are usually within the top tiers are usually 80 base, such as Zephiel and B22 Roy. This also means that with a Boros engine being able to draw up to 2 cards at least once per turn, so long as there's at least 2 white bonds and you want to keep a Boro at the front. This also means that you get an engine and it's a little bit harder to stall you out. Combining this with a lot of good tall cards, such as Takumi 4, Ryoma 5, Mamui 6, and even potentially Queen Noka, you can also basically summon a lot of units onto the board and basically overwhelm the opponent. Considering you also have a lot of swings, it's very easy to keep with the deck. And overall, it's just a deck that always has to be respected because the thing is that even a lot of the mid-range decks can just instantly crumble to it just because they don't always draw their evades. Next, we have Mercedes. Mercedes is an interesting MC that's probably not really brown, kind of like Lysithea and a few other MCs. The main thing that comes with Mercedes is that she has a tap flip 2 effect, which can summon up to 2 units per turn. You have a 3 coster lower and a 1 coster lower. And there are a lot of good 3 and 1 costs, various colors such as purple. The thing that also makes this really devastating is that Tethys 3 also can untap for basically free and allow the Mercedes to tap and flip 2 again because that skill is not once per turn. This means that you could get potentially 2 3 cost beaters and 2 1 cost beaters. And considering that Tethys can be one of the deploys as well, that can make a pretty devastating board for a lot of MCs to handle. With the early turn burst, that means that a lot of MCs that run low copies can actually be overwhelmed pretty easily by this MC. However, the thing to keep in mind is that after that, it's usually pretty gassed out. So the thing is that the Mercedes has to close out the game very quickly, or it gets closed out on, or just slowly gets burnt out by everything else. Next up, we have Yuri. Yuri is basically a brown MC that tries to +1 through Shrewd Gamble and using various CPs for good effects. The thing that makes Yuri pretty scary is that there's a lot of good counter techs that can be ran as CPs that work well in Yuri because you want to be able to proc that skill as much as possible. Having stuff like Rhea CP on top of Sothis and Byleth CP are pretty nasty to deal with. And Yuri himself is actually a pretty good CP because he can grab CPs from retreat by discarding it and flipping itself. This also includes that you can grab play extenders such as Edelgard or Dimitri or even Claude. Yuri can be a pretty competent MC, and the 1 cost being able to block things such as Keating and hero emblems can at least leave it a little less prone to some of the early game shenanigans that purple offers. However, the thing is that at the end of the day, being a brown MC usually leaves it a lot to having to rely on things such as Byleth CP in hand in order to survive some of the burst turns, and then relying on your opponent being whittled down slowly to where Sothis' effect can come into play. Next up, we have Leaf. Leaf is a really good yellow MC that has multiple bridges that can be useful, as well as multiple final promos, that being Unifier or even B22, and then tries to use a lot of yellow's value in order to eventually stabilize and then overwhelm the opponent. The thing is that Leaf is very good at creating a board thanks to Unifier. Discarding two, or flipping a bond and discarding two, or flipping 2 bonds and discarding a leaf may sound like a very costly effect. However, considering you have stuff like Final Holy War from Seliph, the thing is that you can grab back a lot of the leaves that are placed face down and then put them back in the hand. This makes the leaf very difficult to kill, and when you're not facing stuff such as Zephyl, it's very hard to punish the leaf from doing things like this, which then eventually overwhelming the board with stuff like Julian, Sigurd, as well as Deirdre just for ramp, and also denying Dragon Stones eventually. Um, the thing is that Leaf can pop off pretty quickly. The main weakness is just having so many copies of himself makes him a little bit prone to things more than you would expect. But on the flip side, it usually means that he has like a lot of evades in hand. The only issue is that Unifier usually involves tossing one of those evades, so it's actually kind of a dangerous situation. Next up, we have Lissa. Lissa is an MC that doesn't get talked a lot, but it actually is a sleeper MC in my opinion. The thing is that the 3-2, in my opinion, is probably the better MC, although there is the B1743, which is not bad whatsoever. The 3-2, while it's a 60 base, has a pretty powerful effect which, on hit and destruction, you can heal a 3 cost or lower for retreat. A lot of good 3 costs usually include Henry, Faye, and May, which means that you can start doing things such as overclass and looping with that. When you have stuff like Peony for 3 or your best friend, you can also buff the Lissa in order to hit a little bit more reliably. The other method that you could also use is that with a B17, you can be an 80 base so long as you're higher up on orbs. You also have a flip one effect that heals equal to the amount of orbs that you have, which can sometimes be pretty good of an effect, but it also can mean that it's a little inconsistent because what you want to heal may not always be within that orb threshold. The thing is that you could also use Jenny overclass in order to at least heal an orb, and then probably get yourself closer to that threshold. For flip one, it's actually a pretty good heal if you can get it to that. Though usually the 3-2, in my opinion, is a little better. The 4-3 definitely has like a lot of potential. You could also be a 90 base with Sumiya in mind, which can be difficult for a lot of MCs to hit. So, now we can talk about Erica. Erica is usually a purple MC that uses a lot of the support values in order to gain advantage. Stuff like a constant hero emblems or using Lilina's effect after destruction. And then you also have things such as Elliewood, which can move the board around. This also helps accommodate Erica's main problem of being able to reach backline. When you combine it with things such as Garrick, which is a very powerful card because it's a 4 cost that summons a 1 cost, and usually purple has pretty good 1 cost just thanks to Faye and Myrrh. And with Erica, she's a lot more difficult to gas out because once per turn, so long as there's 3 allies in the front, which includes Erica herself, she can draw a card. You can also slightly bypass self-supports thanks to her second skill. Though the thing to keep in mind is this doesn't necessarily mean that you're out of the woods because you could always support a second of the self in the process, which usually is the case for Erica in particular, but not always the case for a lot of the others. Overall, there are a lot of dangerous cards that can be within Erica, and it's an aggro deck that's a lot more difficult to gas out, kind of like a Boro. So it's something that even a lot of the mid-range or even the stall decks can sometimes have issues with. Next up, we have Makalov. Makalov is an interesting MC that at the beginning phase, he cannot be untapped. However, if you discard 2 cards and the card that is in the opponent's top deck is a 4 cost or higher, he gets to draw 3 cards and untap. You usually need to combine this with stuff like Pan and Tinny in order to get most of the effect. So long as you could do stuff like that, you're usually an MC that can +1 each turn, and then you're, well, able to attack in the process. Being a low evade MC is probably one of Makalov's biggest drawbacks, but having to rely on what is basically close to being considered a gimmick is not something that's ever really a good thing. Although, you can also run things like Patty, which can punish a lot of the high cost decks such as Leaf in the process, so there is that to consider. Next up, we have Soth. Soth has a few variations. There's mono, there's black, and then there's what I would call the Bumblebee variant, which is considered a black and yellow. Although we have also seen red kind of creep up every now and then. And I have seen more pure yellow than I want to admit. Soth basically has an effect where on the opponent's turn, if they attempt to deploy anything or even summon, he can flip 2 in order to destroy the enemy. This can make things pretty awkward to go against Soth. When you're not a 1 to 2 range MC, you also have a harder time clearing some of the value cards. When you have a difficult time clearing a lot of the value cards, Soth can usually plus pretty hard with stuff like Micaiah in the back, and then you have stuff like Nyx, which after a Bane, you get to flip one of your opponent's bonds face down. Parry can help bypass one of Soth's biggest issues, that being class change in particular, because it also destroys the 1 cost immediately once per turn. While it's an auto, which means like any one class is automatically destroyed and can be somewhat baited. The thing is that it's still a pretty good effect just because it can stop a lot of shenanigans in the process. Next up, we have Alm. Alm is a red MC that usually relies on overclass. This is because Alm has a skill which drops the overclass cost change by 1. Although this doesn't necessarily include overclasses in particular, it's any red card. So suddenly things like Sheeta, who is a 4-3, suddenly becomes a 4-2. Or you have stuff like Saber, which is a 4-2, suddenly becomes, well, a 4-1. um, Usually with Alm, you usually want to combo with a lot of your overclass pieces, stuff like Mei and Fei in particular, and then usually you choose 1 or 2 other overclasses of choice. Jenny usually being the strongest one, though you can have stuff like Delthea, which is pretty nice. And some people do run Celica builds, which is okay, although I do find those builds usually struggle a little bit, especially if the MCs are a little bit too tanky. The big thing is that you also would run stuff like Happy, so that when you do have things like your May chain ending, you can bounce some of the stuff back just to at least keep Alm's board from being overwhelmed. Furthermore, you also can heal back Mays thanks to Mercedes CP, which can heal back 3 costs or lower. That includes a lot of overclass pieces such as Mei Fei in particular, and then of course you can grab the 1 cost that you need. Being able to cycle once per turn and getting plus 10 during that turn is also pretty nice. Next up, we have Lucina. Lucina is usually a aggro deck, but it can play a little bit mid-range. Mostly it relies on tempo through the 5-4 in order to get bigger allies on the board. Usually you want stuff like Na 3 or Lissa 4, as well as other things such as Noe 4, in order to get some of the value within the process. You have stuff like Lissa, which can destroy an orb and then heal Lucina back into orbs. You have Noe, which if she strikes first, you get to grab one of the bonds from your bond area and place it back to your hand. There's also some things that you could run like Sumia, which can help a little bit if you're kind of getting stalled out. Although you could also run more aggressive and use stuff like B22 Crom, which is a hero emblem and also a 60 base if you're on more orbs during your turn. And you have stuff like Frederick, which after a class change, which Lucina does a lot, for a flip 1, you can basically summon it from hand and get a couple cool various effects such as not being able to be shuffled around. The thing that's also nice about Lucina is that she has a pull or a push effect after another blue ally or herself attacks. This makes it a little bit easier for her to manage the board and basically able to mitigate threats that could be on the field as well. You also have Xena, which makes a lot of the 1 costs and lower suddenly very valuable attackers in the process, which means that you can't really ignore Lucina's board too much. Overall, it's a very strong MC, and while it does have some flaws, then for the most part, it's a very powerful blue MC that can pop off in the right circumstances. Next up, we have Felix. Felix is mostly a brown MC that usually kind of is what I would call a monopilot MC. These usually being stuff like Al, for example, where a lot of the MC is doing the work, whereas everything else is usually kind of supplementing the MC. Usually you can run stuff like Dorothea in order to dance with the Felix in order to get an extra attack. However, Felix also has a CP, which once per turn you can discard it in order to untap the Felix. Felix also has an effect where if you toss a Felix, you can grab another sword card from retreat. This includes Felix's himself, or you could also grab things that are of various colors. Such things including if you were running purple, for example, you could grab stuff like Joshua or Zephiel. With Byleth CP and Sothis, it can be a pretty threatening MC because the thing is that when it focuses face a bit, it means that you can't go too low on orbs, or the Felix might just be able to burst turn through you and finish you off. But the thing is that because it's one of those monopilot MCs, it's a little bit reliant on Felix being able to do all the work, which isn't always a good thing, especially when you're usually going minus in order to redo your attack. This also means that you're technically pitching an evade, which means that it can leave you a little more prone to burst turns that follow up. It's still a very dangerous MC in the right circumstances. Finally, we have Tail 2. Tail 2 is a yellow mage MC, which once per turn, well, not necessarily once per turn, but if you crit, and you can use a tome from your hand instead to crit with it. If she destroys an enemy, you can draw 2 cards and discard a card. This basically makes her a pretty good cycler. And the thing is, that's also nice, is being in color with yellow, you could also use Larce BS. So instead of discarding a card from hand, you could flip the Larce bond skill down for the crit instead. This means that you technically go plus in terms of hand, which can be really nice for decks like Tail 2. When you combine this with stuff like Leaf, which usually wants stuff in the retreat that are unifier targets, stuff like Julia, for example, just to grab back, it makes the combos like Tail 2 pretty cool to use, and you have stuff like Tine, which not only are good draw cards, but also can crit by discarding a tome card from the bond area as well. With all that said, these are all the MCs that are currently being played. I feel like there are a lot of predictions that can be made, and from what I can think of, these are the ones that I feel like could potentially make it to Top Cut. This doesn't mean that they will guarantee to make Top Cut, and it doesn't mean that any of the other decks that I've not listed cannot make it. First off, I think Roy has a very good possibility to make Top Cut. This is because if either of them are running LIS or B22, there's a lot of things that can be done within the process as far as getting through the bracket. B22 is just a very good value engine, where stuff like LAS has a lot of burst potential. It also can punish some decks that usually run a lot on Dragon Keats. Though I will say that without Core and Kingdom of Vala being here, LAS does lose a little bit of that aspect. So it has to catch a lot of the purple decks or the blue decks in order to do that. Following up, I definitely think Zephyl is one of those that will definitely make Top Cut. Zephyl is just a very dangerous MC, and the thing is that if none of these decks are fairly prepared for Zephyl shenanigans and Zephyl gets the right high roll, it could just stomp through a lot of the competition. That doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to make it out, but it's very likely that one of the Zephyls will make it out in the process. I do think that Exalt Crom can definitely make it out if the other player is playing Exalt. On the other hand, if they are playing something like Mono, it is also possible to get through the bracket, though I do think that the Monocrom players will also struggle a little bit with some of the decks like a Boro, for example. Overall, though, I do think like Run of the Croms could technically make it through Top Cut. I think Henry can also make it through Top Cut, but a lot of it also depends a little bit on the luck of the deck. The thing is that Henry, when it misses promo, allows the other player to basically play the game as normal. It's also a deck that relies a little bit more on going first than any other deck in the game. This means that if you do go second, you usually can stand a pretty good chance against the Henry, and if the Henry misses promo, a lot of decks usually can stand up okay against it. I also think a Boro has a pretty good chance of making through Top Cut. The main reasons is that it's just a deck that can punish a lot of aggro, and there is quite a bit of aggro within here. The other thing is that there are quite a few MCs listed here that only have one range. In fact, the only ranged MCs are basically Micaiah, Mercedes, Henry, Lissa, to some degree, is not a ranged MC unless she goes to the 4-3. And then, of course, you have Leaf, which can only be a ranged MC if he goes to 22 and flips a bond face down, or is on the 4-3, which can flip a yellow bond face down or the pole, or finally, if he has the 4-3, that said 4-3 in the bond area and flips that face down, which then also leaves Tail 2, which is a ranged MC. So, for the most part, there's not a lot of ranged MCs, so Boro could actually go through this bracket pretty hard. Leaf is another one I have like pretty high expectations of. It's a deck that, when piloted correctly, can usually get through a lot of crap. The only thing is that there are a couple purple MCs, and two of those being Zephiel in particular, makes it pretty miserable for Leaf to kind of get past. It's going to take a little bit of luck in order for the Leaf to make it through, but it is still possible to kind of get through the bracket. Who knows? Maybe even misses out on facing these in the process, or only has to face it once and somehow gets through the rest of it dominantly. Thing is that MCs like Soth aren't necessarily too bothered by Leaf in particular, because usually Leaf can wait a little bit, and you have stuff like Unifier, which can basically get some stuff out of the process. When you use your deploy from hand, it means that they also have to consider that in terms of baiting as well. Um, Obviously, Erica is another MC I think can really get off, although it does rely a little bit on the support base in order to get through. It does have to kind of aggro down through some decks, and there are some like a Boro where it probably will struggle a little bit. And Zephiel might be kind of an interesting one just because Erica is also an MC that runs a lot of copies of herself. Still, that doesn't mean that Erica stands no chance of winning, as a lot of the support base is pretty nasty, and usually a lot of cards like Dwarf Roy, which is B16 Roy, also has plus 10 when attacking in the process. I do think Soth has a pretty good chance of making through Top Cut as well, even though like I'm not sure what exactly this Soth is. Thing is that it can punish a lot of these decks in the process, and there is some things like Soth 4-2 which can protect itself a little bit against the Zephiels. This is because it has an effect which protects it from destruction skills so long as an ally has been growthed or leveled up. I can't remember which of those in particular, but basically they're both kind of the same thing. Lucina is also another one that I kind of expect to make top cut. This is mainly because Lucina is overall a pretty good deck that usually doesn't have a terrible amount of weaknesses, but it is a deck that could also be constantly teched in the process. Still, I don't think that means that the Lucina stands no chance of making it through. Everything else, while I have it listed, um, especially like Micaiah, for example, because I think Micaiah is also another deck that could potentially make top cut in some ways. Even though I didn't mention them, doesn't mean that there's no chance of them to make it through Top Cut and then remain victorious. After all, at the end of the day, a lot of it goes back to the pilot more than the deck itself. While the deck can definitely have some limitations, which can limit the player on choices, that doesn't necessarily mean that the player can't pilot against these choices either. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this segment. This is Colonel M. Thank you for watching. Have yourself a great day.